So I'd like to welcome everybody to the Clinical Trials Methodology Course 2016 webinar series. The topic for today's presentation is adverse event reporting and safety monitoring. So go to kahoot.it on your browser, enter the game pin, which will come up when we share the screen, enter your name, and then select the symbol that corresponds to the correct answer. But for now, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. So Dr. Robert Silbergleit is a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Michigan. He's a co-investigator in the leadership of the Neurological Emergencies Treatment Trials Network and is the PI for Rampart, which was a national multi-center, large randomized controlled clinical trial of paramedic treatment of status epilepticus. And he's also PI for ESET, which is an adaptive multi-center randomized controlled clinical trial of emergency department treatment for refractory status epilepticus. So, Dr. Silbergleit.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's great to have a chance to do this. This is the third year that they've had me do this talk, which is, I think, one of the drier talks in the series. But we'll do the best we can with it. And even though it's dry, it's actually very important. So we're going to be talking about adverse event reporting. Are you seeing my screen?
Yep, we can see your slides now.
Yes. Okay, so one of the problems with adverse event reporting is that there's inherently a lot of subjectivity to it, and I think that this cartoon really wraps up that subjectivity. An adverse event to one person is different to other people. So try falling down and scraping your knee, then you can talk to me about pain. So it all depends, but that's what we're going to be talking about. What does it depend on, and how do we report it, and how do we consider it? So the objectives of this talk are going to be talking about the purpose for adverse event reporting, identifying reporting, what's involved with reviewing the adverse events, how we code them, and then how we report them to oversight bodies. Those will be sort of the 5 steps. And there's a lot of overlap between these, so there'll be some back and forth, and we'll cover some items in a couple of different places, but that's okay. That's going to reinforce. So the purpose may seem obvious, but it's definitely worth being explicit about. The purpose of adverse event reporting is multifold. And one of the purposes is to identify safety concerns that exist with interventions in a clinical trial. And so being able to figure out what's unsafe or potentially hazardous about an intervention is going to be critically important. We're going to do that in a couple of different ways. It's also important to exclude safety concerns. So we also want to report adverse events so that we can know that we can allay concerns that we might have had about toxicity of an intervention. And that seems similar. It's sort of the other side of the coin, but really there are some differences about that as well. And then the third thing is to contextualize the risks. So we want to talk about risks of the intervention, but we want to talk about them in the context of the medical risks that are suffered by the patient population that we're studying. And then, of course, the fourth goal is also very important, is to comply with federal regulations on event reporting. There's some reading that is worth doing on the background of this. There are 4 guidance documents that I think are actually worth reading. It's very hard to recommend reading guidance documents usually, because regulatory guidance documents are usually obtuse, long, complicated, and unhelpful. These, I really think, are exceptions to that. The OHRP guidance is directly applicable to trials that are not FDA regulated, but really there's very little in the regulations for non-FDA regulated clinical trials about reporting of risks and adverse events, and most of what we're going to talk about actually comes from the FDA regulations and the GCP that gets interpreted through the FDA. That being said, so that there's sort of this triad of FDA guidances that started in 2009. The 2012 one sort of extends and clarifies that. And then the 2015 draft guidance that has not yet been finalized, but has been out for comment for about 10 months now, sort of does one step further and sort of clarifies some issues that were still left in the unclear after the 2012 guidance. So they really build on each other. These three taken together are really useful because they really represent a cultural shift that FDA has been pushing on adverse event reporting. And I think that it's a really smart, clearly written, clearly argued request for a change in culture. The culture that they were trying to change in this set of documents was the culture that said what adverse event that the right way to do adverse event reporting is just to report everything and let somebody else sort it out. And the idea was that as long as you mentioned and reported anything that could possibly be a safety concern to anybody, then you had done your responsibility as an investigator. And what FDA strongly reacted to was the fact that that didn't work at all, and that reporting everything was as useless as reporting nothing. That if they're awash in data that doesn't mean anything, that doesn't have any interpretation, then there's no way to interpret safety from that. So the culture that they were trying to get at was to say, yeah, report things to us that are really weird that the drug does, that you know that it was caused by your intervention, that was highly unexpected and not noticed. But for everything else, where a single case wouldn't really tell you anything, that shouldn't be reported. And what I want you to do, on the other hand, is take all the things that would happen routinely and just look at them between your intervention group and your non-intervention group and tell me when the event either happens more than you expected it to or more than the placebo group. And so that really is the cultural change that's wrapped up in these three documents. It sort of set out as a philosophy in the 2009 document. It's clarified a little bit more and sort of attuned with the regulations a little bit more in the 2012 document. And then the 2015 document really extends it, not as much for what we're interested in. Most of the 2015 document is about drug development programs and what you do when you're actually dealing with multiple trials. How do you do this when you've got a whole series of trials looking at a particular drug? But there are some parts of the 2015 that are very relevant. So we'll come back to some of the elements that are in those, but that's the philosophy, and it's definitely worth reading these documents. So to think of this purpose in another way, what we really want to do is separate out the important information, the meaningful information, the wheat from the chaff, or, as I interpret it from this picture, to see the dog and the soldier. So there are things that are going to jump right out at you and be very stark as safety problems, and that's like the dog on the white background. It's clear, and no one's ever going to miss it. And then there are things that are more subtle that you want to be able to pick out, which are clearly there, but require some interpretation, like the soldier against in camouflage against the background. And then, interestingly enough, just to take the analogy one step further, we want to know the relationship between these really obvious events and the subtle events, just like we see in the relationship here between the dog and the soldier. So we want to be able to get that sweet spot and try to identify all of those things, the subtle and the obvious, and figure out the purpose between them. There are lots of ways of measuring safety. Adverse event reporting is really only one of the ways of measuring safety, so it's worth thinking about that. There's one of the things that makes neurology trials often distinct from other types of trials in other places in medicine is that safety is often actually determinable on the primary outcome measure, because the primary outcome measure in neurology studies is quite often neurologic function or neurologic outcome, functional outcome. And if the thing that we're working with is acting on that neurologic outcome, it can either cause benefit, efficacy, or it can cause negative efficacy. And a lot of the things that we most care about in neurology trials would really be the things that do affect that outcome, that functional outcome, in either a positive or a negative way. So if you think of things like the NINDS-TPA stroke trial, the original stroke trial, could go way back to the example that everybody loves and uses over and over again. Really the thing that matters most in that trial is obviously the primary functional outcome, and there seemed to be benefit. And then what's the proper safety measure for that trial? And obviously the most widely noted safety measure for that trial was the rate of hemorrhage. And then we argue about, well, is it the rate of all hemorrhage, or is it the rate of symptomatic hemorrhage? And then how do we define symptomatic hemorrhage? But really, one really could have easily argued, and I think it's probably true, that more important than hemorrhage as a safety outcome is the effect on functional outcome at the end of the day, because the adverse neurologic outcomes caused by hemorrhage were already included in the primary outcome measure. So if there's a positive outcome measure despite that negative, and that negative toxicity is actually represented in that primary outcome measure, that's a measure of both efficacy and safety. And it's probably the most important way. So that's one way of measuring safety, and it's important to make that explicit, because a lot of times if you don't explain it that way, people don't understand it appropriately. The next thing is going to be other predefined safety outcome measures, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in future slides. In fact, I think a primary outcome measure, I think I jumped the gun and talked about that. And then the third way we're going to talk about it, and most of what this talk focuses on, is monitoring of adverse events. So this is the slide that really goes with what I was just saying about, that's right. This is the slide about predefined safety outcomes. So we talked about the primary outcome being important, and now let's talk about the second, which is the predefined safety outcomes. So predefined safety outcomes are going to be like adverse events, but these are going to be the adverse events that are of special interest related to your therapy. They're going to be the adverse events that you either think are caused by your intervention or that other people think are caused by your intervention. And you're going to have a limited subset of them, and you're going to follow them much more closely than you follow all events. So when you select these, you need to have a couple of different criteria for them. They need to be practical. So they need to be something that is a patient-oriented endpoint that matters. They need to be things that you can reasonably measure. They're going to need to be things that you can identify in the time span that you're collecting data. They should be objective to the full extent possible. The more that clinical judgment has to determine the event, the less likely it is going to be believable or reliable to a user population after the study is published. It's got to use the available information. So I hinted at that earlier, but I mean, if the best way to determine the outcome measure is with a convalescent MRI, but only 10% of your population gets a convalescent MRI, and you're not willing to pay for a convalescent MRI in everybody, then that's not going to be good as part of the definition of your outcome. As I said, these outcomes are going to be carefully defined. So, I mean, if you had an outcome that was pneumonia, for example, you'd want to have a very specific definition of pneumonia, because there's all sorts of gradations of pneumonia uncertainty, and you want to be able to have a definition sort of like the definitions that the CDC uses for different levels of pneumonia. And you can say that it needs to be clinical and radiographic and have a physiologic parameter, so it has to have fever and abnormal X-ray. But CDC sometimes requires a culture as well, so it could be a narrow definition if you want it to be really objective and really well-defined, but you want to balance that against it being practical. It needs to be communicable as well, and by that what I mean is that you can't have the definition be so complicated that it takes up a paragraph in the protocol And at the end of the day, when you have to present the paper, you'll say, this adverse event, pneumonia, for purposes of the study, has to have this and this and this and this and this, and it takes a paragraph to describe it. That won't be accessible to the audience when you're done with the study. So the definitions should be concise, but meet all these criteria. And you really should spend a fair amount of time getting some real agreement from a significant user community about how you define these predefined safety outcomes that you're going to follow. So the next step is to follow the adverse events that occur that you never anticipated. So everything adverse that happens needs to be reported. But, excuse me just one second, let me just, okay. So let's talk about adverse events and what adverse events are and where they're defined. So from a regulatory standpoint, adverse events are really sketchy in how they're defined in regulations. And the things that make it really confusing is that there are similar but not identical terms that are used similarly but not identically in multiple places in the regulations. So here's all the places that you do find mentions of adverse events, adverse reactions, or things that sound like adverse events. And you find them in 21 CFR 312, which is the FDA regulations on INDs. And so when you have an IND, you are required to report adverse events, and there's some discussion of that in that regulation. Also in the 314 regulation, which is the new drug application regulations. Similarly, 21 CFR 812, the FDA regulations on devices, on IDEs, investigational devices, and investigational device exemptions, talks a little bit about safety concerns and safety reporting, again, using somewhat different terms. And then, again, in a parallel form, the 21 CFR 814 regulations, which is the pre-market approvals or the 501k clearances for devices, also talk about safety reporting and how that needs to be done. Then there are the FDA guidances that I mentioned on adverse event reporting, and those are actually better. And then FDA also has this sort of standing regulation that says, unless countered somewhere else in FDA regulations, everything that you need to know and do is covered by the International Conference on Harmonization, the ICH Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, GCP guidelines. And the ICH GCP guidelines talk about safety reporting primarily in the main clinical trials guideline, which is the E6 guideline, and then it touches it briefly in E2A and E9. So there's, again, a few places there, and those are, unless countered by FDA guidance, those are applicable to FDA trials as well. Similarly, the ISO is the ICH for devices, and they also have a GCP guideline for devices that touches on safety reporting. And then there's some safety reporting guidances from the NIH, and particularly the National Cancer Institute. So those are all places that talk about safety reporting a little bit. But it's also worth mentioning, and quite notable, all the places in the regulations where adverse event reporting and safety reporting are neither defined nor described at all. And these are really somewhat surprising. But 45 CFR 46, the common rule that we are shortly about to get a revision of, doesn't mention safety reporting at all. So there's nothing in the basic guidance that sets up IRBs for non-FDA regulated trials that mentions this at all. In 21 CFR 50, the FDA regulations on human subjects protection in general, so all the things that talk about what we tell patients and consents and human subjects protection programs in general, none of that talks about safety reporting. 21 CFR 56, the IRB regulations that set up IRBs. There is no requirement in the federal regulatory body about reporting adverse events and safety problems to IRBs. That does not come out of federal regulations and IRBs. And then the ICH E2B, which is the clinical safety data management section, doesn't really define adverse events or talk about reporting either. So it's really fascinating what we do and don't have for consistency. We really have a profound lack of harmonization. Synonyms of adverse events that occur in these various documents. So I said all these mention adverse events or something like adverse events. So the terms used are experiences, safety consequences, health consequences, safety effects, safety occurrences, adverse outcomes, adverse occurrences, adverse effects, and adverse reactions. And really, you'd think that with all these terms, they would be defined slightly differently and they'd all have slightly different meanings and that there might be some important differences. But as you read the guidances on these documents, the guidances really say all these terms are pretty much synonymous. They don't define them distinctly. They don't explain what's different about one than the other. And for the most part, they're all adverse events. The possible exception to that, probably notable exception to that, is the reaction, the adverse reaction. So the adverse reaction is always to a drug. So you can not have an adverse reaction unless it is a response to a drug. But otherwise, there's not much distinction made between these terms. Okay, so here's our first quiz. Select the most accurate statement. FDA guidance suggests that all AEs be reported expeditiously to the IRB. The common rule distinguishes between adverse events and adverse outcomes. And C, safety outcomes should be predefined. Okay. Well, I'm not sure I emphasized this well enough then. So the FDA, it looked like the most accurate statement people selected was A, that FDA guidance suggests that all AE be reported expeditiously to the IRB. And no, the FDA guidance is actually suggesting that, and maybe it's my wording of the question, but the FDA guidance suggests that adverse events that are anticipated and cannot be interpreted as a single event are better reported in aggregate, where you can look for differences in frequency between the groups. I probably should have said to the FDA, so I will modify that in the future, because I guess there are IRB requirements still that, of course, adverse events get reported and serious adverse events get reported immediately and expeditiously to the IRB. But the FDA guidance is actually going the other direction. The FDA guidance is suggesting that reporting individual events that are anticipated do not have meaning from a safety perspective. Obviously, people got it right that the common rule doesn't distinguish between adverse events and adverse outcomes. In fact, the common rule doesn't mention this at all. And really, what I apparently didn't emphasize well enough is that safety outcomes, as opposed to adverse event reporting, really should be predefined. That it's very important to have the predefined safety outcomes of interest, and that those are very important to determining safety and reporting safety in a clinical trial. Well, let's change gears a little bit and let's talk about what is an adverse event anyway. So adverse events are any untoward medical occurrence occurring in a subject, and so that can be anything that's negative. We usually talk about negative things that at least require some degree of intervention or treatment. When we define the adverse event, it's very important that we report it in an informative way. So the thing that is most useful is to report syndromes or diagnoses if those can be inferred. So, and then and then that's as opposed to just symptoms if we can't infer anything about the pathology or the mechanism. So if, for example, somebody has fever and cough and an infiltrate on their chest x-ray, you could report that as 3 separate adverse events: fever, cough, and an abnormal finding on the chest x-ray. But it would be much more informative, put those 3 things together and say that's probably pneumonia, and report the syndrome or the diagnosis of pneumonia. There's some clinical judgment involved in that, and that's fine, that's important. That's why we're got trained physicians doing clinical investigations. But that is by far more meaningful in being able to analyze at the end of the day, because we're going to analyze by the reported terms. If you have somebody who has a fever and cough and a normal chest x-ray, that's going to be a more difficult clinical judgment. It could be reported as pneumonia still, if that's what the clinical impression is. You don't have to know for certain. You just have to think that is most likely what's going on. You want to be as accurate as you can. If the clinician, through their judgment, is not convinced that that fever and cough represent pneumonia, then those could be a different diagnosis entirely. It could be bronchitis or something like that, or they could be just reported as symptoms. If it's reported as symptoms, then it can't be an event that is fever and cough, because those symptoms are not groupable without a syndrome or a diagnosis. So if you wanted to report just fever and cough, you'd have to report separate events, one event for fever and one event for cough. If you want to report them together, you need to give the syndrome or diagnosis that groups them. So just as important as what are adverse events are what aren't adverse events. And these are where we get into some difficulties, and some people really have trouble grasping a couple of these terms. But things that are not adverse events and do not need to be reported as adverse events themselves are outcomes. So things like death, surgery, endotracheal intubation, for example, are not adverse events. Why aren't they adverse events? They're not adverse events because they don't tell us anything about the medical condition that occurred. So it's not that they're not adverse. There's no question that they're adverse, and they might even be events in and of themselves. But much more importantly, they're the things that happen in response to an event. So you have a myocardial infarction, and as the result of being in the trial, or even as just while you're in the trial, and then you die, the event is the myocardial infarction. It's a fatal myocardial infarction. So death is the outcome from the myocardial infarction. Surgery is performed with some indication. The indication for the surgery would be the adverse event. Surgery would be the outcome, etc. So the one people that have the hardest time with is death. So people say, how can death not be an adverse event? So there's no question that somebody who dies usually has an adverse event. It's just that we don't call it death because that's not informative. So we find why they died, and that's the event, and then we mark it as a mortal, fatal adverse event. But the name of the event should be something other than death. Other things that don't need to be reported are pre-existing conditions. And there's one important exception to that, but things that happened, the diagnoses that happened prior to enrollment in the trial do not need to be reported. So if somebody has fever and cough before they get enrolled, and then they get enrolled in your trial, and then while they're in the hospital, somebody says, oh, did you notice they have a fever and cough, and gets an x-ray, and they diagnose pneumonia. That pneumonia that is diagnosed on x-ray after enrollment does not get reported as an adverse event if from history it's clear that the symptoms actually began before the enrollment in the trial. The exception to that is when a pre-existing condition, something that was already present at the time of enrollment, gets suddenly, precipitously, dramatically worsened during the clinical trial. So if you come in with pneumonia or some other chronic condition, but all of a sudden after treatment it gets dramatically worse, then that can still get reported as an adverse event. It should be reported as an adverse event. Again, it's judgment call as to which of those is the case, and that's really why most deaths are still reportable as adverse events, because a lot of times the death is going to be, especially in the kind of acute care trials that some of us do, people come in with a condition like a huge stroke that has a very high expected mortality anyway, and they get enrolled in the study because of their huge stroke, and then they die after enrollment of their huge stroke. Then what is the event? The event was stroke. The stroke was a pre-existing event, so you wouldn't normally report that as an adverse event, but one usually can make the argument pretty clearly that if it went from being if you went from having a stroke and being alive to a stroke and being dead, that was a precipitous worsening of the underlying condition. I'm not actually sure it always is, but that's the way it's usually handled. Other things that are not adverse events are abnormal results of tests, if those results are not considered by the investigator to be clinically significant. So it is common for a lot of sites and a lot of clinical trials just to take every blood test that is done that has a parameter that is outside of the laboratory's list of normal ranges and report all of those as non-serious adverse events. That's allowed, but I think is poor practice. So most things that fall out of abnormal ranges are not clinically significant and don't need to be reported. It's actually I think a little bit ironic that this is actually a practice that has gotten worse in recent years, because it used to be that in the age of paper medical records, we would just print up a list of the patient's lab values for their whole stay, and it was very easy for the site investigator to go through that list and just mark NCS for not clinically significant on every abnormal result that really didn't have any significant meaning. And then that piece of paper could be saved in the file and was very easy to use as a source document when monitoring came around. Now the problem is twofold. First of all, we order a friggin' more lab tests. Everybody seems to get even more lab tests every day in the hospital than when I was a student. And it's harder to annotate those because they're all in the electronic health record, and it's usually much easier for a monitor to pull them out of the electronic health record to make sure that nothing's missing. And so it's hard to annotate them as not clinically significant in the electronic health record for research purposes. But those don't need to be reported. Other things that don't need to be reported as adverse events are other people's problems and near misses. So events that happen sometimes in clinical trials, you have safety things or adverse things that happen to somebody other than the subject. And the example that I always use for this most clearly was in our Rampart study, where we were using auto-injectors with midazolam or placebo to give ion benzodiazepines to pre-hospital status. The auto-injector had a big orange end where the needle comes out, and that is always supposed to go against the patient's skin. And when you hold the auto-injector, you're supposed to hold it around the ends without moving any fingers or thumbs anywhere near the ends of the auto-injector so that you don't get stabbed. But every now and then a paramedic would hold the auto-injector upside down so that the needle end was away from the patient instead of toward the patient, and then hold it with their thumb right over that orange end. And then when they plunged it against the patient, the needle would come out and stick through their thumb and spray the contents of the auto-injector against the ceiling of the ambulance or sometimes into their thumb. It was adverse. It happened a few times out of 1,023 treatments. But it wasn't an adverse event because it didn't occur to a subject. Other things that, and we'll get to in a second, those are reportable safety problems, but they're just not adverse events. And we'll talk about how they are reported in a second. The other thing that falls into that category are near misses. So usually protocol deviations that could have hurt a subject but didn't. So something that happened that wasn't supposed to happen, and it was an accident, and it was a problem potentially, needs to be remediated, but nobody, no harm done, no foul, no blood, and nobody actually gets hurt, so it becomes not an adverse event. So those kinds of protocol deviations are also reportable, but not adverse events. So what those problems are unanticipated problems. And that's how the regulations define them. And so you can think of it as this Venn diagram. There are adverse events that happen that were not unanticipated problems, that there was no protocol deviation, nobody did anything wrong. They're just adverse events that happen. And then there are unanticipated problems, as I just mentioned, that are not adverse events. So protocol deviations that could have hurt somebody but didn't, or things that were related to the trial that hurt somebody other than a subject. Those are unanticipated problems, but not adverse events. And then the intersection there are adverse events that were caused by protocol deviations or other types of mistakes. And the key here is that to FDA, B and C get reported, but A does not. So there are some properties of adverse events that are worth discussing. These are the things that we ask people to report every time they report an AE. And the ones that we really want to focus on are these first three: the seriousness, expectedness, and relatedness of adverse events. We're also going to ask people to collect severity. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about collecting treatment resolution and outcome. But those turn out to be less important. Seriousness, expectedness, and relatedness become important because those are the ones that are going to require expedited reporting to FDA. So expedited reporting is an adverse event that is serious, unexpected, and possibly, or maybe probably, or definitely related to the treatment. So what makes an event, an adverse event, a serious adverse event? So what makes an AE an SAE? Seriousness is determined by these criteria. An adverse event is a serious adverse event if it's fatal, or if it's life-threatening, or if it causes or prolongs a hospitalization, or if it results in a disability, congenital anomaly, or if it requires some intervention to prevent permanent impairment or damage. So those are the things that we use. If it's an SAE, we're going to have a different category of reporting. We're going to collect more information about it, and it's going to have other concerns as well. Expectedness is much harder. And expectedness is sort of changed in the FDA guidances over this period. So FDA was sort of struggling with how do we get people to turn in less AEs, to report less of these AEs that they don't want to know about, right? So the philosophy was AEs where reporting of a single event wouldn't be informative, but they had to make it fit the existing regulations because they didn't actually change the regulations when they changed these guidances. And the first notion was that, well, what we don't want are all these events that are anticipated in the patient population that is being studied anyway. So all the adverse events that happen to people who are in the neurointensive care unit, that have had a stroke, that have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, all these, they get a lot of medical problems that are anticipated, and they didn't want those. And so they had to make it clear eventually that anticipated adverse events shouldn't be reported. But they were struggling a bit because the regulations already said that expected adverse reactions don't need to be reported. And they were trying to use that regulatory criteria as the way to say that you don't need to report. But expected adverse reactions are only drug effects, right? Because adverse reactions as opposed to adverse events are only things that are already known to be drug effects. And those, by regulations, had to be listed ahead of time. So there's really no way to list all the bad things that happen to sick people. So they really couldn't use that as the distinction. So what they've now made it clear is that they think that anything that is a adverse reaction has to be also related, which is our next thing that we're going to talk about. So in order to be, that's how they have sort of finessed how to avoid the reporting of anticipated adverse events. So that's a little convoluted, but realize that they don't want anticipated adverse events to be reported. Expected adverse reactions are those that are listed in the investigator's brochure. So those definitely don't get reported. But these things that are common in the subject's clinical scenario don't get reported either, but it's now because of relatedness, not because of expected. Unexpected events are events that are not anticipated from the intervention or from the subject's clinical scenario. And what the new guidances have added is that unexpected adverse reactions also include things that you did list as expected adverse reactions if they happen in either an unexpected frequency or in a frequency that has an imbalance with the placebo group and the intervention group. So aggregate imbalances of anticipated, common, expected events become unexpected events that need to be reported as unexpected events. Relatedness. So relatedness is always a little bit tricky. What we've done in the net is actually try to make this algorithmic, and this is a algorithm that we've modified for acute events from a protocol that was developed by the Allergy and Immunology Institute of NIH. Most recently, the FDA guidances have suggested collapsing what we had previously usually listed as 5 categories of relatedness. So usually we had talked about things being not related, unlikely related, possibly related, probably related, or definitely related. But the most recent guidances have suggested that possibly is really a problem for people because people have this notion that everything's possible. And if you don't have a very clear algorithm, almost everybody says things are possible. And it wasn't clear whether, and they were trying to get rid of this over-reporting. So people now favor, the FDA favors not related, unlikely, probably, and definitely. The way that we've made this systematic is to use the criteria that the FDA has set up for relatedness and talk about unrelated being things where the timing doesn't indicate that this would be likely related to the intervention and there's clearly another cause. You move from unrelated to unlikely if, regardless of the timing, so even if the timing is suggestive, if another cause is possible, or if what's happened is something that the intervention is not something that the intervention is known to cause. And if you have one or both of those, then you fall into the unlikely category. Skipping possibly and going to the algorithm for probably, it would be all 3 of these in order to be designated as related. And again, remember, we're trying to raise the bar here for relatedness so that we don't over-report. So for probably related, you want to have all 3 of these things. You want to have timing that is suggestive that it's likely to cause it, there not being another more likely cause, and it should be something that the intervention is known to possibly cause. And if it has all 3 of those things, then it can be probably, and then you go one step up from that, from definitely, is if you have all the same criteria, but there's no other possible cause. It just, you're sure it's from the drug, nothing else was possibly causing it. So I think those are pretty good criteria, and it gets away from that notion where people want to say that there's sort of an intuition that I don't want to be hiding a related cause. So I want to have this very low threshold for calling something probably related, but really that's not in the interest of safety reporting and not what the FDA wants. So they do want you to have a fairly high bar for probably, and I think that does make sense. You're not doing anybody a favor to report something as probably related when you really don't think it is. So moving on, so those were the three criteria that get you expedited reporting to the FDA. The next category is severity, and severity is trying to get at how bad is this event that happened. And it's useful sometimes. I think it's much harder to standardize because it's just really hard to compare what is really severe nausea and vomiting and use that same scale to talk about really bad brain tumors. So brain tumor occurs, and it's a really bad brain tumor and a not so bad brain tumor. So trying to find a single scale that encompasses all that severity is challenging. But they exist, and they work to a certain degree. There are any number of ways of doing this. By far, I think the most common is the CTCAE, which is developed by the Cancer Institute. It's Common Terminology Criteria for Adverse Events. And the way that this works is that there's a big book. You can get it online. There's an app that has some of this stuff as well. You look up your event. It's a controlled vocabulary, but only with a few hundred diagnoses. And it gives you specific criteria for that diagnosis for what a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 would be. If you don't have that particular event in the book, then you just use these general terms here. But I wouldn't worry too much about it because it's a vague notion. It doesn't work all that well. Similarly, we collect treatment, resolution, and outcome for all the events. That is, we want to know, to the best of your guess, what's the date of onset, what's the date it's resolved, was at the end of the resolution, was it gone, was it persisting at the end of the study, was it with a residual deficit. Those are all things we want to catch, and the outcome. But again, these are not critical items, and I'm running out of time, so I'll move on. I don't think let's skip this as the Kahoot because we're running out of time, but maybe you can just open up the microphones. Everybody can check this. Which of these events cannot be an adverse event? Which of these is not an adverse event? Sam, is it possible to open up the microphones and just have people shout out, or?
Yes. So if you'd like to take a shot at answering the question, raise your hand and I can make you a presenter.
Let's move on. When we're talking about identifying adverse events in your safety plan, you want to be looking at what period you're going to be collecting the events. It's not uncommon to specify a different period for non-serious adverse events from serious adverse events. So you might only collect adverse events in a limited period. If in an acute trial, maybe 24 or 48 hours around that's most proximate to the intervention, and then serious adverse events for the duration of the data collection. That's a very common way of doing it. So you're going to say over what period you're going to look. You're also going to have to define when you're going to look for your adverse events. So you might collect adverse events for the first 7 days of hospitalization, and then SAEs for the duration, but you'll want to say whether during those first 7 days you're going and collecting it every day, or whether you're just looking back at the chart at the end of 7 days. And similarly, how often are you going to contact the patient after hospital discharge during a follow-up period? All of that should be defined. You're also going to say where you're going to look. So are you going to look for adverse events just through a review of the medical record? Are you going to look for them just by interviewing the subject? Are you going to do both? All of that should be defined ahead of time in your safety plan. So the naming of events, I think that I will talk about here in a couple of ways. So let me talk about disambiguating them. So the naming events, we're going to report events entirely based on the name. So even though for serious adverse events we're going to have a narrative, we're not going to use the narrative to categorize the event. We're just going to use the name to categorize the event. So the name has to be as informative as possible. So a name like bleeding or hemorrhage is terrible, right? Because we don't know what kind of bleeding that is. I don't know if that's bleeding from a wound, or nosebleeds, or intracerebral bleed, or aortic bleed, or vaginal bleed. You need to provide more information than that and make it less ambiguous. The narrative description that goes with serious adverse events is also very important. Narratives are things that we don't practice reporting nearly as much as we ought to. It's a learned skill. We don't teach it as well as we should. We've been trying to improve that within the network. It's reasonable to use templates to help people do it. Really, again, it's finding that balance, just like when a resident is learning to present a case to an attending. You want them to provide enough information that the attending can make their decisions, but not so much that they go on and on and on and drone on forever. And I usually think that about 1,000 characters should be enough to describe most serious adverse events. And realize that every time that people are creating these adverse events, they're creating some loose ends for other people to clear up. So you can see this guy at his office, he says, I just have to create a few loose ends for other people to clear up, then I can get out of here. So that's what reporting adverse events is. It needs to happen in a timely manner. Typically, the process within your trial will be to do some kind of internal review when people submit adverse events, do an internal review for administrative errors, completeness, consistency. That's not a safety review. It's just making sure that the people that you're passing adverse events onto have the information that they need. And then you usually have some form of independent review. And then this is going to be different whether it's a small phase 1 or phase 2 trial or a major phase 3 trial. For a major phase 3 trial, we're going to have an initial level of review, which is somebody who's usually paid for by the study, but outside of the team, outside of the study team, outside of the leadership, whose role is simply to be an independent reviewer of your safety adverse events. Usually just to look and see whether events reported, whether they agree as an independent person, are serious, expected or not, and related or not. Then that person, after those are reviewed, will still get sent up to the FDA and to the Data Safety Monitoring Board. So I thought I was going faster in time, but I am running out of time. I do want to talk about coding adverse events in our last 3 minutes here. Coding adverse events is inherently an exercise in lumping versus splitting, and you can easily obscure information by either lumping too much or splitting too much. And the FDA guidance recognizes that and says that one needs to be careful not to do either of those, and there are some examples in the FDA guidance, but not a lot of clear guidance on how that one should do that. The temptation to do that, and the problems really come from the available systems that we have. So it used to be that people just reported verbatim terms. Whatever a doctor called an adverse event would be what got reported. But the problem is that there were way too many synonymous terms used in medicine, and sometimes they were used exactly synonymously, sometimes a little bit, and some people used them one way and some people used them another way. And so there have been a number of controlled vocabularies created so that people are using the same sort of terms. And the most common one used in clinical trials is MEDRA, which is come out of the ICH process and is a freestanding nonprofit organization that makes money off of the pharmaceutical companies, but is generally available at lower or no cost to academic programs. And it has tens of thousands of terms and is the one that's most commonly used, and we'll talk more about it. There are several others. The World Health Organization has both the WHO ART and the ICD-10 system. ICD-10 we think of as a billing code in the United States, but it was really developed, ICD-9, ICD-10 were all developed as epidemiology tools by the World Health Organization and only co-opted for billing much later. ICD-10, which we just started using for billing in the United States, has been used by the World Health Organization for all its epidemiology for over a decade. CoSTAR and SNOMED are two other controlled vocabulary systems, and I don't know too much about them, and they're not as widely used. MEDRA imposes a hierarchy, so people report things verbatim, like sick to stomach might be reported as an adverse event. There's a bunch of software that will match that up to a bunch of known lowest level terms. For example, sick to stomach maps to feeling queasy. feeling queasy, and a bunch of other things like that map to a preferred term, which is nausea. The preferred term is usually what gets reported and used, although that groups to a number of higher level terms like nausea and vomiting syndromes. That gets grouped to a high level group term, and then to a system organ class. There's a lot of multi-axiality in the system, though, so things like pneumonia maps up to respiratory problems, but pneumonia Klebsiella maps up to infectious disease. So there's a lot of ambiguity there. And the problem is that with tens of thousands of terms, you still, within the control vocabulary, have a lot of the splitting problems that you have with verbatim coding. So just as some examples, if somebody uses the verbatim term gold, that can be a typo for cold, but even if you get an accuracy problem and report cold, that might mean cold like a viral illness, or it could mean cold like hypothermia. And so there's problems with some of those mappings. Coders cannot interpret multiple events. So if somebody reports polydipsia, high blood sugar, and polyuria, we know that that means diabetes, but the coding software doesn't know that. So all of these need to be taken into account, and again, that's why you go to the syndromatic reporting. Reporting of AEs, as we talked about, there's a coding, there's a reporting process to your IRBs, and then and those are IRB specific because those don't come out of the regulations. There's reporting to the FDA that does come out of the regulations and guidance, and we've talked about that quite a bit. And the DSMB looks at everything that goes to the FDA and usually has its own chartered definition of when it wants to look at safety outcomes as well. And I will skip that and end now so that there is no time for questions, but I can stay on for a little bit if people are willing to stay on and ask questions. Sorry for running late.
Thank you. So just a reminder to everyone, if you do want to ask Dr. Silbergleit questions about the presentation, just click on Request to Interact Live, and I think there's still a few people left in the room, so if you have questions, you can also use the Q&A box if you'd like to ask a question. If not, thank you everyone for joining today and for hanging on through the presentation and through our experiment with Kahoot. If you would like to obtain CMEs for today, please complete the evaluation form, which is found at, it's a bit.ly link, so bit.ly/R25eval, and it'll take you directly to the evaluation form with all the directions for contacting us for CMEs. So the final webinar in the CTMC series this year will be on October 21st at noon, and we'll be talking about special topics in human subjects protection, and our speaker will be Dr. Pearl O'Rourke. So looking forward to that and to seeing everybody on the 21st. So thank you for joining today, and thank you again to our presenter. Thank you, Dr. Silbergleit.